I would like now to introduce today's presenters. Michael Jensen, Chief Research Officer, guides the, guides the practice's research agenda and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. Alicia Mittal, Practice Director, is a member of the IT services team and assists clients on topics related to digital transformation, applications modernization, and adoption of other advanced technologies. Nitish Mittal, Vice President, is a member of the technology practice covering digital transformation and applications. He covers horizontal technology across AI, automation, data and analytics, interactive services. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Michael.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Just a quick note. I think you guys all know that I'm beaming from Texas, and we have electricity. For those that were interested in what happened in Texas, it was pretty interesting. We've moved to a third world country. We were -5 degrees, but I'm happy to report that this week we've gone from -5 to 80+ degrees. We've opened the windows, and things are starting to feel like spring here. So it was quite an interesting week. But on with the show here. The discussions for today are going to be around the digital transformation as it's been, as we've seen it through the pandemic, and then how do we see that transforming at scale post-pandemic. And so Alicia and Nitish are going to go through this with me. And let's start off with the kind of the scope slide here in terms of what we're talking about here. So many people think about digital transformation as changing the overall context for the business, changing the business model. We certainly know that's the top issue when we did the key issues at the beginning of the year. It's top issues to change the business model. And that's an extremely important part of it. But we also want to make sure that it also has to be done in concert with the rest of the business. So there's two other things we have on here: digital for efficiency and digital enablement. So not only trying to change the business model, but also the underlying platforms and the way that people interact within the organization, the efficiency of the overall design. All those things have to come together in this overall plan, if you will. So what we're going to do is talk about these things as we go forward here. And let's do this. Let's start out with, before we get into our data, let's just get data from you guys. And we're going to open it up with a quick poll here. And the question for you is, how do you feel about the digital transformation spending in 2021? So all those things that you're spending money on in order to drive the transformation, how much do you think that's going to either increase or decrease in 2021? Now, we know that most of you have flat IT budgets. So, I mean, this is coming at the expense of something else, but let's see where we're going here. Okay, we'll leave it open, get your votes in. We'll leave it open for another 5 seconds. Okay, all right, let's go ahead and publish this. And, you know, it's interesting here. Yeah, so it's interesting here. We've got almost everybody on the increase. And you'll see that just a few people were actually reducing spend, but most people are either between 1 and 10 and 11 and 20. So, and then there's a handful of people that are really going at it with 21 to 50. So I think that's not unexpected. Nitish, I don't know if you had any response or any thoughts on the numbers you're seeing here compared to what we've talked to clients about.
Yep, and Michael, that's a good point. So I think this is broadly in line with what we see as market sentiment. I think most people are bullish on recovery in this market and are spending more. As you said, you know, it's coming at the cost of something else. So they are definitely reprioritizing. But from a sentiment perspective, it's not entirely dissimilar. And if you move on and think about the nature of the transformation, right? What often happens, as you mentioned about the two models of digital transformation, people often conflate it for only digital for growth, or which is digital for customer experience. While that's an important and a critical element, what they often forget is that you need to build it on a robust set of piping. The second thing they often think of is, you know, when they think of digital transformation, you know, I've lost count the number of times People only talk about the Ubers, the Lyfts, the Airbnbs of the world, even those are getting old. What they often forget is how digital transformation is impacting incumbent players in different industries, and how these incumbent players in banking and financial services, in utilities, are rising to that challenge. And what we've seen is these incumbent players are now thinking about digital transformation in a much more meaningful manner, and they're thinking about new business models. So what you have here on this page is just a small reflection of two ends of the spectrum, right? So you have BBVA, what you would call a traditional bank, which is not just focused on leveraging their experience to serve financial needs of customers, but they're also helping orchestrate the property buying experience for their customers. And this needs to be built on a new set of platforms, which we'll talk about. Similarly, if you think about DBS in the APAC region, known for its focus on not having a lot of branches or any branches, and how they're also not just focused on being a digital native bank, but the fact that they want to orchestrate your experience on your utility journey as well. So I think it's important to recognize that A, digital is not just focused on the front office, and B, digital is not just about people in the Bay Area or companies which are born in the last 10 or 12 years, but even incumbent players are adapting to this. And
but
if
Nitish,
yeah.
Nitish, let me just jump in there. I think one of the things that we were seeing here, the pandemic has certainly influenced different industries in different ways, right? And I think what it has done for certain industries, it's accelerated the need to move this faster.
True. Yep. And in fact, if you think about, here in the UK where I am, if you think about the most valued retailer right now, it's not the Tesco's, the Waitroses, the Sainsbury's of the world. It's Ocado, which is an online only or a digital only seller. So I think that's absolutely right. I think, you can take any figure that you want, whether it's Satya Nadella at Microsoft talking about it, or large system integrators. The pandemic has accelerated digital transformation by several months, if not several years in some cases. And we're seeing the results of that in the sentiment that the audience also showcased just before this. And if we flip the question, right, so we were thinking about demand, but if you move on and think about what's happening in terms of who's supplying all of this digital infrastructure and these digital technologies, I'll be remiss if I don't talk about the hyperscale providers. And this is a dense slide, but essentially talks about the staggering, and I think staggering is maybe an understatement, financial performance that the cloud hyperscale providers, whether it's Amazon with AWS, Microsoft with Azure, or Google with Google Cloud, have seen. And in fact, if you think about the message here, one, that all of them are seeing robust growth, and these are not small revenue bases that we're talking about. AWS, for instance, is now in its latest quarter with Andy Jassy's elevation to the Amazon CEO position, is now at an annual run rate of $51 billion a year, growing at 30%. Those figures in the enterprise technology space have rarely been seen before. And when you reconcile this with the fact that you have nearly 2/3 of enterprise workloads which are yet to move to the cloud, this just tells you there's a lot of runway for growth for these players. So no matter which way you slice this, whether you think about how clients are adopting this, incumbents as well as digital natives, as well as the vendor ecosystem, which is in part responsible for supplying the tooling for clients to go digital and adopt these business models, there's robust momentum on both ends of the spectrum. And when we were doing this, we also thought about what does this mean in terms of where digital transformation is funding is coming from, and how that's likely to change. And Alicia, what have you been observing on that front?
Yeah, so I was just about to come to that point. So we talked about how enterprises' objectives have been changing. We're talking about the supply side, the hyperscalers, and the service providers. I think what's also interesting is how internally for an enterprise, the source of funding or the ownership of driving some of these initiatives is really taking a shift. As we see on the next slide, in the pre-pandemic era, while a lot of these decision-making and digital initiatives were actually spread across, business units doing something, the PMO doing something, there's a CDO organization, there are IT teams taking up initiatives, and so on and so forth. In the wake of the pandemic over the past 1 year, what we've observed is a lot of this center of gravity moving back towards the central IT team, taking broader, long-term sustainable decisions for the enterprise to ensure that their foundation of digital transformation is built on a really thought through scalable business models. So that's one big change that's happening. That's just one of the changes. What's also interesting here is apart from the funding model change that we're seeing, the pandemic has also led to three additional changes in the way enterprises are taking up these digital transformations. So if we skip to the next slide, there have been changes in the approach the enterprises are taking, the timelines that they expect out of their digital transformation, and I'll just talk about briefly what each of them mean, as well as the scope. Now, let me double click on each of them. What do we mean by approach? So approach essentially means, in the post-pandemic era where there is no one best way for transformation, each and every enterprise is thinking about what is best suited for their enterprise context. What is their starting state? What is it that they want to achieve? What their culture is, so on and so forth. So some are taking very symbiotic, coexistential kind of an approach where the old IT and the new IT kind of comes together. And some are taking a very, a very audacious rip and replace kind of an approach where they are radically changing, as Nitish, you talked about some of the examples in the previous slides. So that's on the approach side. So essentially no one best way, and every enterprise is sort of paving their own way for it. On the timeline side, it's very interesting. Again, as Nitish, you were talking about Satya Nadella mentioning that over the past 1 year, they've seen digital transformation worth of 2 years happening in 2 months. That is the exact kind of how burning digital transformation objectives have become at this point of time. The timelines that previously used to be of months and years of investment and ROI realization is being shrunk dramatically. Now, what that means is it's not essentially about enterprises, fastening the process. It's essentially about taking decisions of which are the hotspots that they need to invest in, which can give them the best and the highest results. So the highest ROI or the highest payback areas are being identified and targeted first for transformation, and followed by other areas which are important. That brings to the third part, which is around scope. Previously, while customer-facing applications, front end businesses were the key candidates for digital transformation, the pandemic resurfaced the fact that digital transformation, as the name itself suggests, needs to be at an all-pervasive level. It needs to include the back end, the mid office, and all of that. So it's very essential that they do think about digital transformation from an HR perspective, from a supply chain perspective, and all the other business elements that they need to transform digitally to be able to progress, to be fully sustainable for future. So, those are the three key, or rather 4 key changes. One from the funding custodian, second from the approach standpoint, third from timeline, and lastly from a scope standpoint. So Nitish, why don't you throw some light on how exactly has this evolution really happened over the past few years, and of course the pandemic really accelerating this entire pace.
Absolutely. And great points, Alicia. And if I reconcile all of what you're saying to how we see digital transformation in the enterprise, we really see 3 phases. And given how nebulous digital is, we thought it's helpful to put this down in terms of where we are in that ecosystem and provide some perspective. So we really started with a set of these disparate digital technologies about 10 years ago. And what I would call enterprises experiments with digital. Not all technologies found the right use case. Some of these technologies were searching for the right problem to solve versus the other way around. So people were experimenting, and we saw some interesting results. Not all of them scale. And then we moved to a more focused pilot approach about a few years ago, where enterprises either organized in terms of centers of excellence, small groups, cross-functional teams to be able to hopefully scale digital as a technology and as a philosophy. And now we are firmly moving towards digital at scale. Now, the question is, if the pandemic had not occurred, would we still be thinking about digital at scale sitting today? I suspect yes, but there's definitely been acceleration as we discussed. And what does this digital at scale represent? I think it represents all the four dimensions that you mentioned across funding, scope, approach, and timelines. But I think what it also now means, and you're seeing this manifest, is the importance of digital right at the C level. And there are a few examples more recently. Enterprises have been toying with this idea of who owns digital, to your point earlier. Is it the CIO? Is it the CTO? A lot of them have gone through and taken new designations or appointed charters for the chief digital officer, the chief customer officer, the chief analytics officer. You can pick the acronym that you like. But not all of them have had success in that, because what often happens is you can appoint a CDO and a CIO, but unless a CDO has his or her own budget, mandates, and accountability, it's difficult to scale. In fact, what we often see is a CDO without the right budgets and accountability often ends up becoming only the chief keynote speaker, and that is changing. And that's what you see in these two examples here. So Eon in Germany and BT here in the UK. Both what you could describe as our incumbent organizations, to my earlier point, have recently they've created new roles to own the digital transformation mandate. And what's most important is they're not just paying lip service to this, they have instituted an accountability for these new roles right at the board level, both at Eon and BT. And that's, that to me is a sign of things to come. And I'm glad it's here, because it's time that people understood that all businesses are fundamentally technology businesses. And unless we put the right effort in institutionalizing this, this can become difficult. And now what's happening, interestingly, as a result of this is, Michael referenced our global key issue survey. This is also resulting in which kind of digital technologies are people investing in. So Michael, do you want to shed some more light on that?
Yeah, so we asked the question, you talked a lot about the internal dynamics of an organization structure and the process and the investments they're making. What we show on the next slide here is how they're doing that with their outsourcing partners. And so we asked the question about what structural changes are you looking for in the outsourcing context here. And if you look at the top here, it's automation. That's the number one thing they're looking from the partners. Process design is very high on the list. If I look down a little further, the technology scope changes. So it's not just you're gonna be looking to your internal dynamics. You're gonna looking for the governance structures. You're gonna look to all the things that Alicia talked about. But I think you're also gonna be looking to your outsourcing partners to help make that change and accelerate that. And again, this is gonna vary by industry. Everything that Nitish just went through here. Some people are gonna be further along on that line of hyperscaling or just getting started. Some people are just getting started in this conversation. Again, all accelerated by the pandemic. When we asked the question about what they're going to do about the overall digitization, what kind of projects they're putting in place on the next slide, the two major things were the top two were cloud solutions and cybersecurity. Both of those are related to infrastructure security and scalability. The more qualitative but extremely important part are the analytics, so generating insights. So it's great to have a scalable infrastructure, but you've also, the most important part of this conversation is what kind of insights and what kind of information can you gather about your clients to be helpful to them or to understand better what they need. And then along that goes more the mechanical parts of this, the RPA, the AI, those are the things that are going to be around the automation and process improvements. And so all these things come together. It's not just an either or, do one or the other. All of these things come together in the context of an overall strategy. Obviously, you got to have at least one of them on the number one priority list. But I look at these things as all being important. And depending on where you're at in your journey, you may be struggling with one or more of these as your number one priority. So let's talk about how we can transform at scale. And so in the next section, what we're going to do is we're going to take you through some of those critical challenges. We're going to talk about in the context of platform. We're going to talk about it in context of talent. So we got three, there you go. Platform, talent, and partner ecosystem. So we're going to break this down into those three elements. And Nitish, you're going to start off with the platform discussion.
Absolutely. And given we've spoken about platforms a few times already, we thought let's just spend some time in deconstructing and unpacking what this means. And more importantly, why the need to move to a platform. So let's start with the premise of this. One, as we spoke about this era of digital at scale, we really believe, this is being necessitated by two things. One, internal boundaries on which organizations have been built on, especially the IT and the digital organization in the last 20, 25 years, those internal boundaries are becoming less meaningful, in fact, if not fully irrelevant. As we move towards a product-centric IT model, we see these, the operating model converge, and we see these traditional boundaries and traditional fiefdoms really collapse. And so what you see is essentially a tower-based view on the left, which is how most organizations have been. And you could almost say the towers lead to silos or organizational pockets. But we're starting to see this everything as a service or XaaS model emerge on the right, which is essentially a combination of a stack and a pod. Now, what does this really mean? I think this has a few dimensions. One, most clients have realized that the move to being a resilient, agile organization needs to come from within. And this means in terms of how they organize, how they incentivize, and how they think about roles. So, your talent needs to move from a factory-based model, which was being industrialized, to small teams and pods, what the two pizza box model, for instance, right? Then if you think about the layer of system integration, you could industrialize this in the global delivery model. In some cases, you still can, but how do you get proximate, persistent, full stack teams? And you're starting to see that manifest itself in the kind of roles enterprises are seeking, right? Full stack engineers, as anybody would know, fetch a premium in the market and are a rare commodity. And then as you think about decision making, we spoke about this a little bit already when Alicia pointed towards the centralization of funding, the fact that the role of the IT as a standalone decision maker is moving from an age of policy to an age of influence, where it's IT and business. Most business users want to own their digital transformation pathways. And you see that, for instance, in the trend of the citizen developer and the low-code, no-code adoption in the enterprise. And the last one is results. How do we focus not just on SLAs or narrowly thought out metrics to true business outcomes? Now, here you also need organizational maturity, not just service provider maturity, to get to that outcome. Now, if you really so this was the premise, as I said. Now, if you think about the next evolution of this, right? What does this platform really mean? It has different layers and it has to be anchored in value. And as we move to the next one, what you'll start to see is our vision of a platform. And on the left is what we are describing, a digital capability platform. Let me walk you through the thought process. If we move from the bottom layer to the top, we have to start with the performance layer, right? Which is really about how do you do cloud at scale? How do you build security by design? How do you think about network optimization and DevOps? So that's one. Then we think about the automation layer, which is a mix of, as Michael described, some of the mechanical things around process automation, process mining, also automation built in business software and IT applications, right? So not just automation as a silo. Then we think about insights, which is really around how do we think about data and intelligence. So you have a BI or a business intelligence layer, but also analytics and process mining. And then ultimately about interaction, which is how do you intersect with consumers and how do they interface with your brand, whether it's through different devices, virtual agents or chatbots, and interactive applications. The key message here is, the order in which I walked you through is important. What we often see clients do is really approach it from the other end, which is start with the interaction layer first, to our point around digital for growth earlier. While that's not necessarily a bad thing, you can't really create superlative experiences for your stakeholders if your internal piping is not, if your internal foundations are not solid. So it's important to think about this in a structured manner. And the last message on the capability platform is it has to be relevant to all stakeholders and users, not just customers, but your internal customers, which are your employees or the workforce, and also your partners. And that's really important because there is a strong productivity angle to adopting a platform-based model, and it's not just linked to revenue.
Natisha, when I look at this, I think of two things. One is the implications on the talent, and you quickly hit that on the previous slide there. We've got entire competencies and capabilities around that where we talk about the implications to the talent pool, because it's going to have an implications when you start thinking about this whole package, if you will, the whole implications on how people are not only brought into the organization, but how they grow up in the organization and how they perform and excel over time. So it's not going to be about how good is your technology skills. It's going to be how good is your context and how you can make the organization move and transform in a very different way than we've done in the past. So that's one thing. The second thing is you've got this cognitive AI kind of off to the side there. And I know when we built this chart, we specifically put that over there because we didn't want it to apply as a single thing. It's not just a circle on the chart. It's something that applies broadly to all of the layers and all of the different little bubbles on there. It's going to be a layer of sophistication that is going to aid all of these things in improving the overall impact.
Absolutely.
All right. So let me, Michael, you were just talking about the talent part, and Nitish touched upon building a very strong internal capability foundation. I think the implication or the meaning that I derive out of that very solid foundation is beyond the technology to the talent aspect as well that you touched upon. Before we deep dive into the talent of how that's shaping up for the next normal, as we call it, let's first touch upon a little bit about why we are talking about talent and why this is such a big issue. So digital transformation as such, of course, requires the access to right talent. Now that is where a lot of enterprises face a roadblock. And the issue, as we are speaking to a lot of enterprises, is at multiple levels. To begin with, first, there is a huge gap from a talent demand and the supply standpoint. What enterprises require versus what is out there in the market, there is a huge gap between the two, and that's particularly prevalent for some of the next generation and emerging technologies which enterprises are rapidly wanting to invest in. Now, that's one level. The second one is wherever there is talent that already exists, the talent is not at the same, the talent development initiatives are not at the same pace as the technological advancements in themselves, right? So the technology is moving much faster. There are new platforms, new solutions, IP, etc., being built. But are the L&D initiatives and the development initiatives at the same pace, imparting the same kind of knowledge to the available talent? That is where another gap lies. And then there is a third gap, which is around, even though the talent is available, they are trained, but are they deployable? So that's the third level of gap that exists, which essentially means that even though talent is available, they do not have the right level of experience and practical working knowledge for an enterprise to entrust them with the strategic technological initiatives that they are planning to invest in. And all of these essentially, it's sort of a vicious cycle, a self-fulfilling prophecy, because what happens is if you do not have sufficient talent, there's also a lot of push and pull in the market, leading to more attrition. And therefore, again, back to normal of, back to the square one of not having enough talent. So that issue with the talent has been, has been going on for quite some time. And we see that becoming a major issue, particularly for some of these emerging skills. We ask the same questions also to some of our enterprise clients, by means of these surveys in the past. And as we see on the next slide, it's essentially the similar kind of sentiments that the enterprises also share. The shortage of next generation skills being one of the key challenges that they face from a constrained standpoint to scale up their digital initiatives. The second very important issue they're facing is from a retention standpoint and beating that market competition that exists for the limited talent. Third, like I talked about, the quality of the talent, even though they're available, they're not deployable enough. And finally, engaging the talent in a remote workforce. Now that's becoming a key issue more in the pandemic scenario. And I'm sure all of you would have heard a lot of investment banks, JPMs, and some of the others talk about how they've witnessed a dip in productivity, particularly for some of the younger workforce because of the remote working, and they're not really on board with the entire work from home concept. But so far, there does not seem to be any other way out for them anyways. and a lack of integrated demand supply planning from a talent standpoint. So these are all the issues that already exist, and largely enterprises have been struggling with them for quite some time. And in general, there is never a very easy fix for solving people related issues. But what we've tried to do is really give a glimpse of what and how should enterprises think about this talent related issue and think about solving for it as they plan their digital investments, as they plan for scaling and sustaining these digital investments. What's essentially required, as we see in the next slide, is preparing proactively, understanding these roles of tomorrow, reskilling the available resources, and also setting up an organization structure which is sort of conducive to the roles of tomorrow. Let me take that, sort of let me explain that with an example. So say some of the roles of tomorrow, what could they be? If we think about it, blockchain, security, customer experience, all of them are becoming very important and also coming together. Think about having a role of having a talent with an expertise of blockchain security expert, or a customer experience developer, or say a data ethnographer. Now, these are the roles that enterprises are realizing that they will essentially need as they start scaling up their digital initiatives, as they start investing into broader, more transformational digital investments. Now, these roles, as they emerge, with new personas, they also need multifunctional skill sets, which is a combination of technical and non-technical skills. So what you see here, just for a very easy graphical understanding, almost a decade ago, what there were really, single skilled expertise that existed. You were either a developer or a tester or, a designer, and so on and so forth. Over the last 1 decade, it was more of a T-shaped structure. You have one broad-based and deep expertise, and in addition, you have knowledge or working knowledge of one or more other technologies. And mark my word, I'm largely talking about technologies only. Now, in the post-COVID scenario, what's happening is it's really if you could visualize a comb-shaped structure, that you have capabilities of multiple types, which is spanning across technical and non-technical skills, right? So having a blockchain security expert who understands not just blockchain, not just security, but also what could be the approach, or what could be the various regulatory requirements that this person needs to be aware of to be able to design the entire security structure of the organization. Their work impact of this new kind of skill sets and the new kind of personas that we're talking about will spread beyond just execution to also transformation and innovation for the business. Needless to say, this, as this gets more contextualized and more personalized for the enterprise, the customization to individual business requirements will also go up. And from an organization structure standpoint, aligning the changes from a service delivery standpoint to a customer or business-centric standpoint will start becoming even more and more pronounced and more important. So essentially, the roles of tomorrow really requires a different paradigm shift in terms of how we think about the roles, the organization structure, how we train them, how we retain them, and how we build the entire structure around of the organization to make them productive enough. So Nitish, we just touched upon two key aspects from scaling up digital transformations. One is from the foundation part of the platform. The other is the enablers of that transformation, which is the talent standpoint. Now, there's a very important third layer. Any digital discussion is incomplete without that third set of participants. Why don't you talk about them?
Absolutely. And great points, Alicia. I think if you think about the partner ecosystem that especially driven by the talent point that you just articulated and the product-centric IT organization we've been talking about, it really has very interesting implications on who you partner with and how you do that. let's start with the hyperscalers again, right? And so this is this talks about the different set of partners that we typically see involved in any digital transformation initiative. In some cases, all of them are competing for it. In some cases, they have a frenemy relationship. They're partnering as well. But all of them are, thinking about essentially a similar part of the enterprise wallet share when it comes to digital transformation, right? So starting from the hyperscalers to the system integrators that we see globally, the traditional agencies which are trying to now, get ahead and get more data and technology skills, to the platform vendors or the independent software vendors and the niche SIs, which often are built on very specific technology skills. All of them have their own value proposition and their core competence. But what we often see is they're starting to step on each other's toes in some pockets or the other, right? So whether you think about SAP acquiring process mining capabilities through the recent acquisition of Signavio, if you think about what Google Cloud is now trying to do with higher focus on business intelligence and analytics capabilities through acquisitions and optimizing their cloud offering. So we're starting to see very interesting patterns emerge. But if you really think about this and think about valuations, and that's where, if you really follow the money, to my point around the hyperscalers earlier, the kind of growth and the runway for growth that they have is really putting them in a very privileged position to drive transformation at scale for clients, right? So, at a combined level, all three have potentially close to $100 billion in annual revenue, right? I'm not counting Alibaba or Ali Cloud in this. But the valuations, to my point earlier, are quite staggering, right? So nearly $2 trillion for the lot of them. And I'm not here to speculate, but will potentially Amazon carve out AWS at some point? It is a possibility. But the broader message is that the ambitions for these players is not limited by what they've traditionally done. So they're expanding into new areas, and we're starting to see a lot more friction in this. And if you move to the next one and think about growth for these players, so it's a very interesting picture. So there are two sets of players here. You have the IT and the business process service providers, and then you have the hyperscalers. Let me break this down. This is a pre and a post-COVID growth scenario. So what this chart essentially tells you is who thrived and who struggled during COVID. So this compares their post-COVID numbers, so September ending quarter last year, to pre-COVID numbers, December ending in 2019. And this is only the organic and constant currency part of this, folks. So we're trying to strip out the impact of M&A and currency fluctuations. And what this tells you are three interesting things. To start with, the smaller service providers, the niche service providers, a lot of people had written them off in the early stages of the pandemic because we saw a ton of supplier rationalization requests coming in from the enterprise community. But a lot of them, if you think about their revenue and their growth, did quite well during the pandemic, partly because they had a smaller base, partly because they had lesser legacy to contest with. The second implication is, not a lot of large service providers, barring the likes of an Infosys or maybe a Genpact, thrived during the pandemic, and there were very different reasons, partly because of digital scaling, which we spoke about earlier. And then the last message is, if you think about the legacy portfolios, they are starting to struggle. So, older legacy infrastructure companies, declining at times, a low growth business, are having a hard time figuring out what this means. So I think what we're likely to see at the end of this is a new pecking order emerge. I think service providers and partners who adapt or pivot to partnering with clients on what we're calling digital at scale are expected to thrive, and that has very interesting internal implications as well as external manifestations for them.
Nitish, this is a really interesting chart, and I was thinking about what you said on the previous chart. I always follow the money, and you can start to see where Wall Street's valuing it, and when you have money, you get more money. And I think one of the, you kind of said it earlier, is the growth up in the upper right is at the expense of many of the other players on this page. And while they're not a direct replacement, I don't think you can replace a large banking system and move that straight to the cloud. That's not feasible by itself. A lot of things have to happen in between there. But the insidious as a service, eats away at the base. And as more and more applications get moved to the cloud, that creates, a ongoing pressure on the existing platforms as they move less and less demand on those and more demand to the as a service conversations, and that favors those in the upper right.
And it's very interesting, Michael, to that point, right? And we took that advice and we followed the money. So we investigated these three stacks in quite a lot of detail last year, and we'll try and quickly cover what we are seeing. So we did these assessments, and I think people in the audience and others might know of our peak matrix methodology, which is a way to assess service providers and different technology stacks. We do this for service providers, we do this for product and platform companies, and a whole range of them. And we did three of them just ending in December last year on the three hyperscaler stacks, and very interesting findings emerged. We're starting to see a workload for payload conversation. Not all hyperscale providers are created equal. We're starting to see enterprises realize that they will grapple with a hybrid landscape. They will grapple with a multi-cloud landscape. But what platform vendors, which clouds do they use for what workload? That's an interesting conversation. With AWS, we're starting to see two emerging trends. They obviously have growth momentum, but a lot of this was driven by the mid-market, and they now have very serious enterprise ambitions, and you see that in their recent results and client wins. The second thing, which is very interesting for AWS, is they are starting to verticalize, so really focus on very specific industry and vertical nuances in terms of the use cases, starting with healthcare and life sciences. I think will Amazon eventually get to retail maybe at some point, but that's a harder battle for them. If we move to the next stack, which is Azure from Microsoft, slight inversion of the AWS problem here. So these are service providers who we believe have interesting capabilities on the Azure stack. And Azure doesn't have a big enterprise problem, right? Because Microsoft has always played well with the CIO and the sourcing and CFO organizations. Microsoft's now trying to bundle not just Azure spend, but also their broader spend on Microsoft 365, as well as Dynamics from a CRM perspective. So again, creating a TCO conversation for clients. We are also starting to see a very industry-specific conversation with Microsoft and Azure, similar to AWS. And just yesterday, they launched 3 new clouds. They've done one on healthcare last year. They've announced one for financial services, I think one for nonprofit, and another one for manufacturing, with a preview for another one for retail in the works. So I think the cloud conversation is now really becoming industry-specific. Now, that's sort of the two big ones which had an early start. Alicia, what are we seeing on the Google Cloud portfolio?
Yeah, so AWS and Azure are interesting for their own reasons. I find GCP really interesting from the standpoint of the incredible growth it has witnessed over the past 2 years alone, since we should say the time it woke up to the need of cloud transformation market around 2 years ago. And two things that really stand out for GCP as a platform provider is, like most of the others, a very strong push towards a verticalized platform solution. And I believe GCP is being more successful at it than any of the others, and a very, very strong focus on building a great partner ecosystem focused on co-creation and joint GTM. So let me just quickly touch upon each of them briefly. So earlier, Google Cloud growth story had obviously been very sluggish, and that is what made it realize that it needs to create differentiation in the market. And so over the last few years, when what GCP essentially did was to adopt a very focused verticalized offering approach, and it has been quite successful at it. Very recently, it also launched a separate strategy for telecom to capture 5G market share, for example. Credit for this industry specific vertical solution initiative is also because of its partner ecosystem that complements complements GCP's cloud offerings. And accordingly, that goes back to my second point, that I made, a very strong positive sentiment that exists among its partner ecosystem, both large scale and niche providers, to engage with GCP. Another interesting aspect about GCP is its partnership with some of the ISVs, SAP in particular. A lot of you would be aware of a dedicated data center in Germany that Google had set up for SAP. And that was one of the biggest evidence of its commitment to this particular partner and to SAP-centric enterprises as they are progressing on their hybrid cloud journey. And if you think about it, SAP is on a very verticalized approach and a vertical solution-centric approach for growth. And that complementing with GCP's verticalized approach kind of complements very beautifully with each other. And that could be that's sort of turning out to be a great option for enterprises to attain transformation while keeping their cost really low. And on the cost front, generally for that's true for all the hyperscalers, but as well as true for GCP as well. On the commercial front, the commercial deals are getting executed have very very creative constructs with options of both fixed discount and consumption based discounts, which is overall creating a great impetus for the enterprises to embark on this journey faster than they would have otherwise.
Hey,
So,
Alicia,
yeah.
It must be fascinating to be sitting on some of these in these boardroom conversations, trying to figure out if they're partners or they're, which one's the fish in the other. Are they partners or competitors?
Yeah. To begin with, they are partners. Let's see what the future says. Of course, right now, the verticalized offering seems like a great partnership. And of course, as GCP tries to, we saw that hexagon, right? Everybody's trying to embark on each other's arena. So till when do they start colliding with each other? Let's see. That time doesn't seem to be very far from the horizon.
Yeah, I think go back to what Nitish was saying, follow the money, because ultimately that's what this is all about. And so I do think you're going to see some other sharks out there in the water feeding on others that, hey, the natural inclination is not just to provide, raw cloud capability, but you actually want to see the services come into the mix and get more sophisticated and be able to continue to make the growth they're going to have to do. And then the question of that is one of margin and investment. How much context do you have to invest in, and what's the sacrifice for margins too?
Yeah. So essentially, one of our thought process for these three big hyperscalers is they're all going to find their own niche and their own sweet spot and be big there. But of course, everybody is greedy. Everybody wants to be the biggest. So the wars continue.
Exactly.
Okay, so let me. I see we are running short of time. So let me round up the discussion with some key themes or the key broad common messages that are essential for a sustainable digital transformation for any enterprise. Number one, building your business with data at the foundation. We talked about different kind of data across that entire platform stack layer, building a very strong foundation of data with the process, people, technology, all of those layers above it is the starting point. Secondly, aligning your talent strategy in line with the business strategy, investing in talent, nurturing the talent for the future. That will be a bedrock to achieve sustainability for these transformation initiatives. Third, adopting agility as the default organization setting, which will obviously have implications on your process design, on your technology selection, organization structure, so on and so forth. So that essentially becomes one of the ways of working for future. And finally, to scale up these initiatives and investments, your partners and the platforms will be critical. So selecting the right platform will be a crucial step in digital transformation roadmap. So these are the four key common themes or the mantras of sustainable digital transformation. Now, again, those are relatively easy things to do. There is one very important element which we haven't still touched upon. And let me first take Jeff Immel's quote on that and see what he has to say before we touch upon that very important aspect. Next slide, please. So he says, if you go to bed tonight as an industrial company, you're going to wake up as a software company. The world changes. Well, Michael, is that simple?
We had the picture here of GE plus tech does not equal Uber. And the reality is most companies will not be Uber or any of the digital native platform or providers out there. So not everybody's going to be an Uber, not everybody's going to be an Amazon. We have lots and lots and lots of legacy businesses out there. In fact, the majority of our economy is still legacy businesses. And so they've got to put this in the context of moving their big battleships, if you will. At the same time, they're trying to move ahead. And so I think there's going to be that constant pressure of balancing the existing world of servicing their existing clients and trying to move forward into this conversation. So no, we do not need a world full of Ubers out there. We need legacy businesses that make up the bulk of our economy to succeed in ways they, make the transformation and succeed in new ways. All right, so thank you, Nitish. Thank you, Alicia. Been very good conversation here. One of the things that we like to do in these sessions is to offer a sample of our insights and what we're going to do here is give the opportunity to get a sample of our data. And this is for our enterprise clients only, because if you're a service provider, we have a different kind of relationship that we would talk to you about. But if you're an enterprise and you're interested in getting one of the peak matrices, I think you saw a couple of them there that both Nitish and Alicia showed you. But if you'd like to get more detail into it, click the button here and we'll be in touch and we'll send that to you and have a conversation with you with one of these segments. We certainly want to have that dialogue, and I think when you have the deeper conversations, we can answer specific questions and we can show you how we're seeing that segment of the marketplace. So a number of people have asked for that, and all right, so let's do this. Let's move to the question and answer, and what I'm going to do here is if you have questions, go ahead and ask those in there. If we can't get them to them today, we will try to do follow-ups on email and otherwise. So let me go with the first question here. Is in cloud hyperscalers, we're comparing vendors such as AWS, Google, and Azure to systems integrators that implement those solutions. As vendors in the top right corner are increasing in post-COVID, when do you see systems integrators implementing those solutions?
Sure. So, Michael, I can take that. And I think that's an interesting question. I think when we were showing those peak matrix assessments, those were fundamentally about system integrator capabilities on those hyperscalers. So we weren't really comparing the hyperscale providers to an Accenture or a TCS. However, having said that, I think when we think about system integrators implementing them, there are a bunch of things. So we see two sorts of broad areas where SIs are involved. One is your classic lift and shift scenarios, or what I would call journey to the cloud, which is migration, which is often easier, can be a one-time activity, but can be longer. And then what we see is how do you optimize the journey in the cloud, not just to the cloud. So, and then there are a bunch of things around that, right? So how do you optimize your cloud spend? How do you make sure you get the right performance from your workloads? How do you make sure you integrate this with your hybrid landscape, which is not everything will be on the cloud, as Michael, you pointed around core banking systems. So there's an ongoing optimization piece where SIs are involved, as well as this often one-time or longer activity in terms of lift and shift or moving to the cloud and different dimensions of this.
Okay, great. Here's another question about how important is it to have an integrator versus working directly with AWS and the other cloud hyperscalers?
Yeah, Michael, let me take that. So, that's an interesting question, working directly with the hyperscalers or taking the route of engaging with system integrators. So, before I answer that question, one very interesting trend that's emerging is almost 3 out of 4 enterprises at this stage already have a decision on which hyperscaler they want to engage with or which platform they want to migrate their workloads to before actually approaching a system integrator for making that happen. So that's one tidbit that I wanted to share. Keeping that in mind, of course, all of us know that the hyperscalers themselves are building up their own professional services arms. Some of them, especially the likes of AWS, are investing meaningfully into their partner ecosystem as well. Now, we believe the benefit or the advantage that a system integrator brings in versus a professional services arm of a hyperscaler is that tech neutrality part and the broad-based service capabilities of these service providers, as well as a very large set of experience across different kinds of enterprises that they have worked with. So of course, there is no direct answer that yes, you should engage with system integrators in all cases, or you should not engage with them in all cases. But essentially, the flow is that in the typical flow for most of the enterprises that's being preferred is to identify their one or more platform that they want to migrate to. It could be a cloud, multi-cloud, or a hybrid cloud scenario, and then engage with the system integrator to really make that happen in your best interest, in the best interest of that enterprise, considering the tech stack of the enterprise in mind, barring any kind of preference for more revenue to a particular platform or any other cloud vendor. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, let's be clear about this though. The hyperscalers and their peers there, they're not competing directly on full service outsourcing deals, right? They're still providing a portion of the pie, right?
A portion of the pie, but like we were discussing, Michael, you never know when the partner starts becoming competitors. So
yeah, I think it's going to be ever increasing portion of the pie, but it's still not a like for like comparison there in terms of one.
So far not.
You can't trade one off into another. One could speculate, and I'm pretty firm that this will probably likely happen, is some of these, you follow the money, some of those folks that have the big money are going to buy some of the folks that have less money, and they'll acquire that capability. But again, it comes down to the business case for making that happen, and the implications of margins may not be as, maybe slow that down for a while. All right, there's another question here. Is there a good litmus test for when you should give up capability in order to accommodate same cloud infrastructures? For example, if application architecture is on cloud services such as AWS, but a specific offering of cloud services, Amazon Connect, does not offer the features of more advanced platforms. For example, in the context of contact centers, are there downsides of separating these? A lot of words there.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't think there's a simple answer, but I'll try and do justice to this. So I think, to my earlier comment around payload for workload, I think we're starting to see that conversation on which cloud fits this use case. For instance, and at the risk of generalization, a lot of the data and AI and ML use cases, we're starting to see, I would say, an increasing preference for Google Cloud, but it's not an absolute answer by any stretch of imagination. Because, if you think about the investments Google Cloud has made in terms of Looker, in terms of Apigee, they're trying to play catch up to the duopoly of Azure and AWS, and they found data to be that tip of the spear. When it comes to contact center, again, I think one of the examples that the question has, Google Cloud has an interesting solution. But when it comes to a lot of the cost-driven outcomes from a lift and shift perspective, it's hard to beat AWS. So I think the short answer is we're starting to see that early days of the conversation of which workload fits which cloud vendor. And then I think at the same time, we're starting to see the first wave of interoperability, right? So Google with Anthos and AWS with Outpost to make sure these work. There are still problems, but that's the quick take for now.
Okay, all right, we need to wrap this. One of the things I was looking at these questions, they virtually all came in around the topic of the hyperscalers. And I want to go back to some of the points that Alicia was making. This is well beyond just the service providers options that you have out there. Alicia, I like the conversation you had around talent. I think this talent is going to actually be the bigger challenge for most organizations, not the technology, but the talent, the culture, it all comes together. So pay attention to that a lot, and the ability to acquire those resources is going to be critical, because it's not just a matter of saying, hey, I need to change out your technology set. It's a much bigger issue than that. And so we go very, very deep on that conversation. All right, if you're interested in other information, we have lots and lots up on the website, our blogs that you can see here, and then also we have lots of content here. So they've taken a short list of, or a long list from a very huge library of content we have on there. Feel free to reach out to us, and we thank you for your time. And there's several questions we didn't get to. We'll try to get to those offline model, but thank you for your time. And thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Matish.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you to Michael, Nitish, and Alicia, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, you will receive a follow-up email within 1 or 2 business days with a link to download the presentation slides, along with accessing the on-demand playback of today's live session. On behalf of the Everest Group and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.